At some point, the effort continues and the result stops. The person hasn't changed what they're doing. The same deficit, the same exercise routine, the same dietary structure that produced measurable results weeks or months earlier. But the scale has stopped moving. Not briefly, as a temporary plateau, but persistently, in a way that resists the usual adjustments. This is among the most consistently reported experiences in weight management, and it is one of the least satisfactorily explained. The standard framing, that the body has adapted, is accurate in a broad sense, but practically empty. It describes the observation without identifying what specifically has adapted or why the adaptation is resistant to correction. What the research in metabolic physiology suggests is that the plateau is not a single phenomenon. It is the visible surface of several simultaneous biological adjustments operating at different levels of the system that collectively reduce the body's energy expenditure in response to sustained deficit conditions. The most common response to a stalled scale is to increase the pressure on the system. The deficit deepens. Calories drop further. This produces movement in some cases, but the relationship between deficit magnitude and fat mobilization is not linear past a certain threshold. Below that threshold, the body's adaptive responses accelerate. Resting metabolism drops, non-exercise activity decreases, and the efficiency with which remaining calories are used increases. The gap between intake and expenditure narrows, not because intake rose, but because expenditure fell to meet it. Training volume increases, more sessions, longer duration. The reasoning is sound, but the body's compensatory mechanisms apply here as well. Research on exercise compensation documents that increases in formal exercise are routinely offset by reductions in spontaneous physical activity, the low-level movement that occurs throughout the day outside of structured sessions. Total daily energy expenditure often remains closer to baseline than the additional training sessions would suggest. The dietary approach gets restructured. Carbohydrate reduction, protein increases, intermittent fasting windows. Each of these carries a legitimate mechanistic basis in specific contexts. None of them reliably breaks a plateau that is driven by metabolic adaptation rather than by dietary miscalculation. The mechanism underlying metabolic adaptation involves a set of biological responses that are not accessible through input modification alone. Thermogenic adaptation, the body's reduction of heat production and energy expenditure in response to caloric restriction, is one component. It operates partly through changes in thyroid hormone output and partly through changes in mitochondrial efficiency. The cell becomes more economical with the energy it processes, extracting more from less. This is a cellular-level change, not a behavioral one. A second component is leptin. As body fat decreases under sustained deficit conditions, leptin levels fall. Lower leptin signals the brain to reduce energy expenditure and increase appetite, a feedback loop that operates independently of conscious effort or dietary discipline. The person isn't failing to try hard enough. Their endocrine system is executing a conserved biological response to perceived energy scarcity. Both of these mechanisms, thermogenic adaptation and leptin-driven compensation, originate at the hormonal and cellular level. They represent the body's interpretation of the metabolic environment, not a failure of the behavioral approach. Research into metabolic adaptation has produced inquiry at two levels. The first is hormonal. Refeed protocols, periodic increases in caloric intake, particularly from carbohydrates, have been studied for their effect on leptin restoration. The evidence suggests that temporary increases in intake can partially reset the leptin signal and modulate thermogenic suppression. This is not a contradiction of the deficit model. It's an intervention on the hormonal layer that the deficit model doesn't address. The second is cellular. The efficiency with which mitochondria process fuel and the availability of the coenzymes those processes depend on, including NAD+, affects the metabolic rate at a level below hormonal signaling. Research into NAD+ precursors and mitochondrial support compounds has examined whether the cellular environment can be made less adaptive in the direction of energy conservation. The findings are preliminary but mechanistically coherent. The commercial category addressing cellular metabolic function, primarily through NAD plus precursor compounds, is distinct from conventional weight management. Its proposed mechanism operates on the cellular machinery that determines how efficiently the body processes and expends energy. That distinction matters when evaluating what the category is and what the evidence for it currently supports. As with most emerging research areas, the gap between what studies examine and what products claim varies widely across the market. A plateau is not the absence of progress. It is the body's active response to the conditions being applied to it. Understanding the mechanisms behind that response, thermogenic adaptation, leptin compensation, cellular efficiency changes, reframes what the problem actually requires. The effort may be consistent. The biological environment receiving that effort has changed around it.